Welcome everyone to my brand new segment here on the channel, Version Versus. This is a segment where I'll be reviewing and comparing multiple different versions of one game, whether they remakes, ports, demakes, handheld versions of console games. So long as they all fit under the same name and have significant differences for me to discuss, they belong in this segment. To differentiate myself from other creators that have done similar comparison review hybrids, I'll be using a point system, awarding each version a number of points for their improvements over the others. To debut this new segment, we continue the Pac-Man marathon with its direct sequel, Miss Pac-Man, comparing it to its 4th-gen console ports. For the arcade version, there's a straight emulation with some enhancements available on modern consoles and PC, and I'll be playing the Steam version to represent it. As for the console port, it's actually quite different in a number of ways, so I think it deserves a spot on this segment. Tengen Miss Pac-Man is available on NES, Master System, SNES, Genesis, and CDI, but I'll be playing the Genesis version for this review. I feel these two versions of Miss Pac-Man represent the different ways to play the game well enough that I can keep the comparison between them and leave the other ports out of the discussion. Miss Pac-Man does exist on plenty of other platforms, from Dreamcast to Java 2 Mobile Edition to Game Boy Color, but they're all essentially the original arcade game with minor changes to the graphics to suit their hardware, if that. Hell, even the smartphone version is just the arcade game with achievements and continues, whereas the mobile version of Pac-Man at least had all those custom mazes to unlock. At their core, they're all the same, gameplay-wise, and there's just far too many to go in depth on every single one of them. As for the console version though, the Genesis version is the best of the bunch, since the CDI version can't be accurately emulated and the SNES version is a little bit slower than the one on Genesis. I don't want to be too wordy here with all the different versions and such, but I figure it's best for me to explain my reasoning behind my choices for comparison now, since this is the debut of the new segment. With all that said, let's get into the story behind Miss Pac-Man. Normally, I don't really talk much about development history, but as we'll see throughout the arcade marathon, the different approaches to Pac-Man sequels by the many different developers that were making them took the series in very different directions. After the massive breakout success of Pac-Man in American arcades, Bally Midway, who Namco had given a license to manufacture arcade cabinets of Pac-Man in the West, got the idea to make a sequel and wring even more money out of Pac-Man. Around the same time, a group of MIT students were working on a side business making improved hacks of existing popular arcade games and pinball machines. They got to work on a Pac-Man enhancement with original characters under the name Crazy Otto. This is when Bally Midway took notice, and they were impressed with the team's work. Having received the license from Namco to make Pac-Man cabinets in the West, Bally Midway figured they could just make a new game and publish it themselves, not realizing the license granted to them by Namco was solely for manufacturing cabinets of the original Pac-Man game, not for the IP as a whole. This mistake led to the development and release of Miss Pac-Man, met with even more massive success than the original Pac-Man. Miss Pac-Man is the highest grossing arcade game ever made, and if it weren't for the fact that it was so successful, Namco would have stripped Bally Midway's license and the series very well could have died right then and there. At first, Namco was furious, but after seeing Miss Pac-Man's massive success, they actually accepted the game as part of the official Pac-Man universe, as well as granting Bally Midway a license to produce more original games with the Pac-Man IP. This deal led to many more sequels, including Junior Pac-Man, Baby Pac-Man, Professor Pac-Man, and more, but we'll get to those ones later. For now, let's get back to how Miss Pac-Man came to be. Being developed as a simple enhancement of the original Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man wasn't looking to change the core formula at all, but to simply make small adjustments to improve on the original game's flaws. In fact, the original developers of Miss Pac-Man didn't even think that highly of Pac-Man to begin with. One of the game's developers, Mike Horowitz, said, "I wasn't a fan, but everyone else on the planet was, so we knew an aftermarket add-on would be popular. Remember this for later, it'll be very important as I get into my critique." Being a simple enhancement of an existing game, Miss Pac-Man released pretty quickly in 1981, less than a year after the original Pac-Man's release, to huge profits and positive critical reception. Most gamers at the time, and even to this day, laud Miss Pac-Man as the superior game over the original and as the best game in the series, or at least the best maze-style Pac-Man game. As for the console versions, they were developed by Digital Eclipse Software and released on NES, Master System, SNES, and Genesis, with a clone of this version of Miss Pac-Man being included on Philips's Arcade Classics for CDI. These versions mostly did quite well, most notably the 16-bit versions, and are very highly regarded within the Pac-Man community for being one of the earliest attempts at reinventing the maze formula for modern audiences. With the history out of the way, let's get into the review and see how these two versions of Miss Pac-Man stack up, and whether or not I agree that Miss Pac-Man is indeed superior to its predecessor. We'll start with the story. As usual, there's not much to speak of, but the intermission cutscenes, returning from the first game, actually show the story of how Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man met, fell in love, and had a child, seen through intermission cutscenes just like the last game. While the original Pac-Man's intermissions were just short slapstick scenes added for nothing other than comedic purposes, Miss Pac-Man's intermissions actually tell a story. Act 1, They Meet, plays after round 2 and shows Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man bumping into each other while avoiding ghosts, and it's a love at first sight. Act 2, The Chase, plays after round 5 and shows the couple chasing each other around. They don't really do much here, they just chase each other, that's it. I guess this is what Pac people do in their free time. Act 3, Junior, shows a stork delivering the couple their baby, and out of the bag pops Junior Pac-Man. Weirdly enough, this intermission, just like the third intermission in the original game, plays 3 times after rounds 9, 13, and 17. It was fine in the original since it was just slapstick with no story, but the cutscene of Pac and Miss Pac being delivered a child playing 3 times is a little bit odd. Like, are we supposed to see this as the same cutscene being played 3 times, or as the duo having 3 children? In future games, they only have 2 children, Junior Pac-Man and Baby Pac-Man, so I'm not really sure what they were going for here. Of course, the real reason behind this is Miss Pac-Man being essentially a ROM hack of the original game, so I guess they weren't able to change it to feature new cutscenes in place of the repeats, or just remove the repeats, so we're left with this weird repeat thing. I know, it's a small complaint. I'm talking about 10-second cutscenes in an arcade game here, but I was admittedly really confused upon first seeing the Junior cutscene for a second and third time in a row. Despite that small issue, I actually really like this new approach to the intermissions. Introducing a new character to Pac-Man's world begs the question, how does this character relate to the others? And they went through the effort of not just showing the relationship Miss Pac-Man has to Pac-Man and the ghosts, but telling a cute little story with it. It's nothing amazing, of course, but for a 1981 arcade title, this is probably the best story in a video game that existed at the time, so props to the developers for properly expanding the world of Pac-Man in a way that feels right. As a final note, the orange ghost, who was named Clyde in the first game, has been renamed to Sue for some reason. So, how does the console version fare in terms of story? Well, it's pretty much the exact same thing, but slightly different. The biggest and most obvious difference is the graphical changes. I'll get more into how I feel about the new sprites a little bit later, but at least for the cutscenes, I think the new presentation is a slight improvement. There are more frames of animation, more detailed sprites, and even some new little details like the heart at the end of Act 1 pulsating and then popping. That's really the only difference in the intermissions, but for some reason the repeat of Act 3 still plays after stage 13, but the second repeat after stage 17 is absent. I'm not sure why they bothered to keep the first repeated intermission, but not the second, but it doesn't really matter all that much since this version actually lets you skip the cutscenes. Hallelujah. The biggest addition to the console version of Miss Pac-Man story-wise is an ending. After clearing 32 mazes in all but the arcade mode, you get an Act 4 cutscene, a brand new cutscene showing Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man waving at the camera before heading off into the background, followed by an ending screen of the couple relaxing on the beach with their 8 kids. By this point, they had canonically only ever had 2 children, Junior and Baby, like I said before, so I'm not sure why there are 8 here, but that's a small nitpick. This ending is super cute and offers a strong sense of accomplishment for beating 32 mazes at once. Additionally, Sue was not renamed back to Clyde, despite 1987's Pac-Mania retconning Sue to be the name of the Purple Ghost, so it's a bit of a missed opportunity to not change the name to be in line with the new canon. Not a big deal, but it's a change I would have liked to see nonetheless. So overall, with the tiny improvements, added ending sequence, and especially the ability to skip cutscenes, I'll award the console version 2 points. Now, let's take a look at the visuals, and as far as the arcade version is concerned, it's pretty much second verse same as the first. The ghosts, Pac-Dots, Power Pellets, and Returning Fruit are completely unchanged from the original game, though the dots' colors do change depending on the maze, and Miss Pac-Man's sprite is just Pac-Man's with more details. The Misses rocks a bow, lipstick, beauty mark, and even an eye, which Pac-Man didn't have at all in the first game. In fact, he still looks exactly the same in his appearances during cutscenes, no added eye or any extra details for him. The added details to Miss Pac-Man's sprite gives her a lot more charm and character than Pac-Man's simple featureless pizza with a slice missing shape, while still feeling like she fits in with Pac-Man's cast of characters as a natural extension of his universe. She's not so over-detailed as to feel out of place here. One thing I really liked about the visuals of the original arcade Pac-Man was that neon blue outline of the maze's walls. In Miss Pac-Man, they've changed things up a bit. This time around, there are 4 different mazes, each with their own color palette. The first features pink walls with red outlines and white dots. The second has light blue walls with white outlines and yellow dots. The third uses orange walls with white outlines and red dots, and the fourth and final maze sports dark blue walls and orange outlines with white dots again. I'm a bit mixed with these color changes. I think the light blue and dark blue mazes look really nice and fit in with the neon aesthetic from the original, but the pink and orange mazes just look off. Especially the red dots in Maze 3, it just looks wrong to me. There's also a new assortment of fruits to collect, with cherries, strawberries, oranges, and apples returning from the first game, joined now by pretzels, pears, and bananas, rather than the Galaxians, bells, and keys from the first game. Even though pretzels aren't a fruit, I do appreciate Miss Pac-Man using actual food for all of its bonus items this time. It's a small change, but it helps the game keep a slightly more consistent theme when compared to the original. That's pretty much all there is to say about the visuals, so let's see how the 16-bit version compares. Obviously, the greater graphical capabilities of the Genesis allow for much more detailed sprites, and they really ran with this idea. Every sprite has much more detail and shading to it, from Miss Pac-Man herself to the ghosts to even the Pac-Dots, and honestly, I'm not really a fan. It feels like they tried too hard to add realistic shading to a cast of cartoony shapes, and it just looks weird. I mean, just look at the title screen here. Miss Pac-Man looks way overly detailed and is just covered in dithering. The ghosts look like they have bags under their eyes and shiny bald spots, and their sprites for Eaten mode just look terrible. The simplistic shapes and flat colors of the arcade game made for a charming and straightforward art style in 1981, but this version's updated graphics try to combine the simple shapes with detailed shading, and it just clashes. That's not to say the graphics on this version are entirely worse. There are some notable improvements. For one, Pac-Man and Jr. actually have eyes this time. Woohoo! I think the maze walls look a little bit better, and there are way more color palettes this time around. Instead of the original 4 palettes for each maze in the arcade game, this version features more palettes than I can even count. It makes every maze feel different, even when you're playing a repeat. Occasionally the palette won't look the best. This one that's mostly black makes the walls of the maze almost impossible to see sometimes, and I didn't even realize there was a wall here the first time I played this maze because of this palette. But 99% of the time, the variety adds to the experience rather than detracting. Even if I don't think a palette looks all that good, the next maze will feature a brand new one, so not a big deal. For this added variety in color palettes for the mazes, I'll give the console version 1 point, but for the better looking sprites, the arcade version gets 2 points. One other area where I think the new graphics really shine are in the cutscenes. I mentioned the added frames of animation before, but these new graphics and animations really make these cutscenes pop. The story in Act 3 in particular looks great, and for as much crap as I gave the title screen, the ending screen does look cute. I'll award 1 point to the console version for slightly improved cutscene visuals. Unfortunately, all of the added detail means bigger sprites, and the Genesis only has so many pixels to work with. At a resolution of 320 by 224, there's only so much you can display at once, and the bigger sprites come at the cost of visibility. To fit the larger sprites, the camera is zoomed in and now scrolls vertically as you move up and down the maze. The camera panning works well, at least in single player, and it's not that big of a deal in all honesty, but it's still a compromise, and they made it for ultimately worse graphics than the original game. Even in the mini-mazes, the screen still has to scroll. At least there you can see the entire maze on one screen, but either your score is going to be cut off when you're at the bottom of the maze, or your lives and level count are going to be cut off when you're at the top of the maze. They really should have had a zoom option to scale the camera back and show the entire screen at once with smaller, lower detail sprites. Considering how good this version is with options and modes, it's a pretty baffling omission. When you combine the zoomed-in camera with the overall faster speed of this version of the game, you may, on occasion, end up getting caught off guard when a ghost isn't where you'd expect them to be, or wondering where one of them went. It's usually not enough to get you unfairly killed or anything, but it does serve as a minor annoyance. 2 points for the arcade version for having the entire maze visible all at once. I mean, the arcade version ran at a resolution of 224 by 288, just like the original game, so they definitely could have made it work on the Genesis by scaling down the sprites and moving the HUD over to the side where they had all that extra room, so I really don't get why they chose not to offer some kind of solution to this camera problem in the console version. That's about all I have to say about the graphics, so let's move on to the sound design. As I argued in the previous review, sound design is an essential element of arcade game design when it comes to attracting players to your machine in a sea of loud noises and flashing lights. Before a player even sees your game, they can still hear it being played, so having good sound design is very important. I also argue that Pac-Man did a wonderful job, for the most part, of attracting players with its satisfying sound effects and catchy jingles, and Miss Pac-Man follows up on that with a few small changes that make the sound design of the sequel even stronger. To start off with the music, Miss Pac-Man features a brand new startup jingle, which I forgot to mention in the script of the last review, and not 1, but 3 new cutscene themes. Unlike the first game, which used one jingle for all 3 cutscenes, Miss Pac-Man has a unique jingle for each one. The startup jingle is super catchy, I'd say even more so than the original game startup jingle. It's got a nice build-up and a fun, exciting end to get you ready to start the game. I also appreciate the fact that they bothered with entirely new music at all, since every other Pac-Man game in existence, aside from this one and Junior, seemed content to just remix the original game's startup theme over and over. The Act 1 cutscene music is even better than the startup jingle, being one of the most iconic pieces of music in the entire series. I couldn't tell you how many times this piece has been remixed throughout the series' history. The melody progresses really nicely, those quick notes are a joy to listen to, the bass is fun and bouncy, and it ends off with a really cool sounding resolution. One of my favorite pieces of music from the entire arcade series. Unfortunately, the other cutscene themes aren't nearly as good. Act 2 is a bit repetitive and goes on for way too long, much like the cutscene itself, and by that point the high-pitched notes just get a tad grating. It's not bad, but it's not great either. Contrasting that is Act 3's theme, which is just too short and simple. Again, it isn't bad, but I don't know, I'm just not a fan of this one. But hey, that's still two great jingles, and they're the ones you'll be hearing most often as they play earliest in the game. Hell, most people would probably game over before even getting to Act 2, so no harm, no foul. The sound effects are all slightly different from the original game, and it's hard to pick which set I prefer because they're both really good. In Miss Pac-Man, the dot-eating sounds are crunchier, and the sounds of being chased by ghosts sounds a lot less like a siren and more ghostly, I guess? It fits a lot better than the original game sound effect, is what I'm trying to say here. The death sound is a lot less impactful than the original game, though. The sound of the ghosts running away in frightened mode now increases in pitch over time, better signifying that you're on a timer to eat them before they become vulnerable, and makes it easier to memorize by audio cue when they're going back to normal on each level. Finally, the sound effects of inserting a coin, getting an extra life, and eating a fruit are exactly the same as the original game. I mentioned in the previous review that eating a fruit sounded a little underwhelming in the original game, but I feel it's actually a little better here since the fruits now make a crunchy walking sound as they travel through the maze. Overall, a solid improvement over the sound design of the already excellent Pac from the original game. So, how about the Genesis version then? Well, the Genesis is famous for its incredibly unique sound hardware. Despite this, the sound effects have been translated to the console very accurately, albeit a lot more bassy, twangy, and crunchy thanks to that Genesis sound chip. Now, to be fair, I'll bring up the SNES version here as well, since their sound hardware is just so different. It's actually very accurate to the arcade game, with only a few minor differences in the sound effects. The samples are different, but it's not nearly as noticeable as it is in the Genesis version. No matter which version you play though, the music is quite obviously changed, and it's really hard to pick as to which I prefer. I'll give 1 point to the arcade version for having the slightly better music in my opinion, but your mileage on this one will vary. It's not a game changer either way, but I like the arcade sound pack just that tiny bit more. Finally, it's time to get into the meat and potatoes and see what's changed from Pac-Man to Miss Pac-Man. On the surface, it's the same game with new mazes and a couple small changes, but when you dig deeper, you realize that a lot of very important design details from the original have been altered or ignored in this sequel. Before we jump into the big stuff, one small change to note is that unlike the original Pac-Man where fruits spawned in the bottom center of the maze over your spawn point, fruits in Miss Pac-Man spawn in from one of the 4 tunnels after you've collected a certain amount of dots and roam around the maze before exiting through another tunnel. They actually stick around for quite a while, so you have plenty of time to grab them, unlike the first game where I complained about the fruit's timer being too short. A great improvement over the original game here. Now let's really get into things and talk about the Ghost's AI. Just like last time, each ghost has a different personality and therefore a different way of tracking Miss Pac-Man and trying to catch her, as well as 4 different states that change the flow of gameplay as they weave in and out of them. I won't go over every state and every behavior like I did last time. I'd recommend watching that review first if you haven't seen it already, so I'll just skip to what's been changed and what hasn't. They start in scatter mode, switch back and forth between scatter and chase mode at set time intervals that get shorter and shorter the more mazes you complete, switch to frightened mode and run around randomly trying to escape Miss Pac-Man when she grabs a power pellet, and enter eaten mode when they're eaten, making their way back to the center of the maze to respawn. These modes are all perfectly intact, as is the difficulty curve from the first game. It's also worth pointing out that the rules of Pac-Man Ghost AI that I described in my previous review are all followed in the same way as they were in the first game, with the exact same set of exceptions. The real changes lie in the targeting AI, and this is where one of my biggest criticisms of Miss Pac-Man comes from. I'm just gonna lay my cards out on the table right now. Overall, I think Miss Pac-Man is a worse game than Pac-Man, and that has to do with 2 major downgrades: the Ghost AI and the maze design. So what exactly is wrong with the Ghost AI? Well, remember that quote I mentioned earlier? I wasn't a fan, but everyone else on the planet was. Miss Pac-Man's designers had issues with the original game, and to an extent, they weren't wrong too. I had issues that I laid out in my original review. The Ghost AI is just predictable enough that high-level players end up doing the same exact movements on repeat, and this perfect Pac-Man play was discovered pretty quickly. This allegedly led to machine hoggers and a boring gameplay loop. However, I'd like to raise a counter-argument to those claims. Machine hoggers I can't really argue against. If you have a high-level Pac-Man player in an arcade, they'll be on that thing all day. However, being the second most popular arcade game in existence, only behind Miss Pac-Man, I'm sure most arcades big enough to even have a high-level Pac-Man player present at any given time would probably have more than one cabinet of their most lucrative game. What I really want to argue against is the point that the gameplay loop becomes boring for high-level players. Look, I'm a speedrunner. I know what it's like to be a high-level player of a video game, attempting to do the exact same inputs over and over again to perfect my run. And yes, in some games that can get repetitive and boring, but that depends more on the game's design and the pace of the speedrun rather than just being an inherent aspect of speedrunning, or in this case, perfect play. Think about it this way. If you were good enough to do a perfect run of Pac-Man, would you really have bothered learning to memorize the AI patterns and movements through every single maze if you didn't enjoy playing the game to begin with? If I found Pac-Man boring to play at such a repetitive level, I wouldn't bother learning perfect Pac-Man. That's why I never have learned it. I know that it would bore me. But clearly others disagree and find the game fun to play through with a high skill level. Miss Pac-Man's designers attempted to fix an issue that only existed for people that didn't want it fixed to begin with, and it led to by far the worst design change in the game. While the Ghost AI remains unchanged for Chase, Frightened, and Eaten mode, Scatter mode has been overhauled and injected with a large helping of randomness. In my previous review, I argued that Inky and, to an extent, Clyde used clever tracking AI to keep players on their toes and catch them off guard while not having any actual randomness involved. It allows for the high skill ceiling of perfect Pac-Man players bending the game to their will while still offering a challenge to average arcade players, which make up the vast majority of people actually playing these games, by the way. In Miss Pac-Man, both end up with a worse experience because you can't consistently perform perfect play in a game that's constantly changing its own rules, thus lowering the skill ceiling, and average players will be sometimes screwed over by something they wouldn't see coming. You don't need to know the ins and outs of the Ghost's AI patterns like I do to subconsciously recognize movement patterns and use it when making split-second decisions on where to go next. The human brain is surprisingly good at doing that stuff by itself. In the original Pac-Man, almost every single death was one where I could recognize where I went wrong and what I could have done differently to keep myself alive, and yes, Miss Pac-Man has its fair share of deaths that are like that too. In fact, I'd say the majority of your deaths will be avoidable for an understandable reason. The problem isn't that there are unpredictable deaths, the first game had them too, it's in how often they occur, and Miss Pac-Man is much worse with this than the original game. Let me show you an example. Here's a clip of me dying going straight up towards the top where Blinky should be heading to his corner, as it's the very start of the maze where he should be in scatter mode, going towards the top left region. Instead, he turns downwards and runs straight into me. I perform the exact same movement and Blinky has gone somewhere else entirely. Despite my inputs being exactly the same from the very start of both lives, the ghost movement had a completely different outcome, and this unpredictability got me killed. It's completely unfair, and this kind of luck-based movement has led me to a lot of unfair deaths. You can't play this game like it's Pac-Man. You have to work around its new mazes and AI and play the game completely differently. And for someone that has a strong muscle memory for the original Pac-Man, it's very hard to unlearn that and rely more on quick reactions in a game that ramps up in speed very quickly. So the question is then, does the console version do anything to fix this issue? Well, unfortunately the AI is completely intact, randomness and all, leading to once again the same movements giving different results. However, the console version adds one simple addition that gives you the upper hand in dealing with the unpredictable AI. It's called the Pac Booster, and it's essentially a run button. It's set to off by default, but changing the options before you start your game and bam! Now the power is back in the player's hands to give Ghost the slip and keep the game going at your own pace. I can't express enough just how much more fun the Pac Booster makes this game. You can zoom through the early levels without any threat of dying, rack up points like it's nothing, and save your stockpile of lives for harder levels later on, where you can slow yourself down and only use the booster when in a pinch. It adds a deep layer of strategy that gives the player an advantage as the difficulty curve increases, so long as they can master it. Thus, the skill ceiling has been restored and the gameplay loop has been made exponentially more enjoyable. Seriously, the power trip of blasting through early levels at unmatched speeds is so satisfying. We'll see this again later in the marathon, but for now, know that this is by far my favorite addition to the console version. 3 points. Alright, now it's time to move on to the maze design. One of the biggest criticisms that I and many others had of the original Pac-Man was its lack of variety, leading to a somewhat repetitive loop. While I agree on the variety complaint, I argue that the difficulty curve and limited lives were enough to carry the experience without it getting boring and repetitive before you get a game over. On top of that, its maze was excellently designed, with dangerous and safe areas weaving in and out of each other, and lots of escape options for the player to use, so they're almost always capable of returning to safety unless they made a mistake. Regardless, more mazes would have been nice, though I uphold my opinion that the game is still fantastic with only one thanks to its strong design. Ms. Pac-Man attempts to solve this issue by making 4 new maze layouts, but with almost every single one of them, fails to replicate the tight design of the maze from the first game. I must stress here that I genuinely appreciate the team's efforts in attempting to solve the original games, that being the lack of variety due to only having one single maze that you played on repeat until game over. This was a good choice, and a necessary one for a Pac-Man follow-up, but I can't help the feelings of frustration and anxiety that come from not having enough control due to the poor layouts of these mazes. In the previous video, I made this diagram to show off the different areas of the maze, the ways they flowed in and out of each other, and how these elements make for a balanced maze. So obviously I'll be doing the same for Ms. Pac-Man's 4 mazes in this video. Before we begin, let's take a quick look back at this diagram from the first game's maze, because I want to reiterate why I feel it was so well balanced and why this excellent design was so crucial to the first game's quality and success, so that I can properly explain what it is about the new mazes that I don't like as much. I'll keep this short, and if you want a more detailed breakdown, again, I recommend watching the original review if you haven't already. These green areas are safe areas. Yellow is still relatively safe, but a little bit more dangerous. Orange is treacherous, but offers a way to safety by exiting back into the green and yellow areas. Gray is the tunnels, which slow down the ghosts as they enter, giving you a slight advantage when escaping, and red and purple are the high danger areas, balanced out with these power pellets to make them manageable. See how they flow into each other, giving you plenty of options as to where to go, and the only places with long narrow paths contain power pellets right nearby, so the player is never going to be totally screwed unless they leave too many dots here after grabbing the power pellet. Now let's take a look at the first maze from Ms. Pac-Man. Here's the maze with the same graphics colored in that I used in the first review. Overall, it has a very similar flow to the original game, with the treacherous orange areas acting as a good in-between from the dangerous red and purple areas to the safer green and yellow areas. There's not too much of any one color, but there are a few notable differences that are worth discussing here. First is the tunnels. They're a lot shorter this time, but there are now 2 sets of tunnels on the top and bottom rather than just 1 set of tunnels in the middle. I like this change as it gives you more options without sacrificing the difficulty of the maze. What I'm not a fan of though is this top section. This is easily the most dangerous part of the maze, being a long narrow pathway with no direct access to the power pellets, but it's still close enough that you can grab the dots here right after getting one of the top pellets. It's not quite as good as the original game's maze, but I would still call this one a well-designed and balanced maze. Easily the best one in the game. Unfortunately, this is where things go downhill. Whereas Maze 1 is my favorite in the game, Maze 2 is by far the worst. Here's the map for the second maze. You see the problem here? There's way too much of the high danger areas and barely any safe zones at all. The only saving grace for this maze are the tunnels, which there are 2 sets of again, both placed in the corners right next to the high danger zones, but even that doesn't really help with these horrible side sections. The hardest parts of this maze, these long narrow pathways are placed in the vertical center of each side, with no escape to a safe zone and being way too far from either of the power pellets. And as if that wasn't bad enough, you have this top section with even more long narrow paths. At least here you have the tunnels, but they won't help you when you inevitably get cornered in either of these strips. This maze just sucks, and the rest of them aren't that much better. Maze 3 is a little better, but its design still feels janky and unbalanced. First off, this is the only maze in the game to feature a single set of tunnels like the original game. Here, however, they're placed awkwardly at the top of the stage and not really next to anything that challenging, making them pretty much worthless on this level. The top of the maze in general is just way too easy, while the bottom of the maze is way too hard. This bottom section here is just terrible, being a narrow path that takes way too long to get from one end to the other, and it's totally closed off and way too far from a power pellet to be easily cleared. Fortunately, it's placed directly below the starting point, but that just means that every time you start the stage will play out exactly the same. You have to go down this section and grab these dots immediately, or you could end up in a risky situation by saving them for later, as this is a very easy place to get cornered by ghosts in. Additionally, the bottom power pellet sections are really badly designed. The power pellet really should have been placed lower, because it's pretty common to end up going down and around this loop at the bottom and then getting cornered by ghosts before you can grab the power pellet. This maze is just awkward and annoying to play through. If you do manage to get lucky enough to get through the second maze 3 times on one set of lives, this maze's 3 back-to-back instances will almost surely get you a game over. Finally, the fourth maze. I'm not a fan of this one either, unfortunately. Just look at this, there's hardly anywhere safe in this map. Even the spawn point is surrounded by long walls, and the entire maze is like this. It keeps you in a constant state of anxiety and never gives you a break. Even the tunnels are pretty useless, being lumped together in the middle and blocked off by walls. The section up here at the top is a real pain in the ass too, and it's real far from the power pellets. Plus, by this point in the game, the power pellet's effectiveness has drastically reduced, so even that crutch isn't very useful. I get wanting to have a difficulty curve, but considering the high difficulty of the second maze, I wouldn't really accept that argument either. And even then, Pac-Man already had solid difficulty progression with a decreasing power pellet timer, increasingly difficult AI, and increasing game speed. And all of that carries over to this game, on top of the increased difficulty through the added randomness in the ghost AI. Did we really need harder mazes on top of all that? I've only ever gotten this far in a legitimate run of Miss Pac-Man a single time, and it was after an hour of grinding out attempts. Bah! So yeah, on the whole, I'm really not a fan of this maze design. The first maze shows some promise, with an understanding of the balance and flow that made the first game's maze excellent and fun to play. And while it's not quite as good as the original game's maze, it's still a fun and well-designed map to play on. The other three, however, failed to live up to this clever design and fumble pretty hard. I know it seems like I'm cherry-picking the tiniest details and using them to declare the maps as bad or whatever, but hear me out on this. These seem like small issues, yeah, but in a game so small, they add up very quickly. I also don't want to give the impression that I think these mazes are terrible, frustrating garbage or anything like that. They have problems, and these problems inform my opinion that Pac-Man is the better game, despite Miss Pac-Man's attempts to fix problems with the original game. That doesn't mean that these maps are irredeemable trash, though. Trust me, it can get a lot worse than this, and we'll be seeing that soon enough. Miss Pac-Man's maze design on the whole is mediocre. It starts out great, but quickly deteriorates in quality with a slew of sloppily designed mazes. And these would be bad enough with Pac-Man's AI, but remember, Miss Pac-Man had the lovely idea of injecting them with a bunch of randomness, which makes traversing these poorly balanced mazes even worse. On the whole, I don't find Miss Pac-Man all that great. It's a fine game, and an enjoyable one to pop in a quarter or two when you go to the arcade, but better than the original? Not by a long shot if you ask me. Now that we've dissected the maze design, does the Genesis version even attempt to improve on any of the issues with Miss Pac-Man's mazes? In a word, no. They're completely the same, just like the AI. Pac Booster comes to the rescue once again in making these mazes more palatable. Thankfully, this only really applies to the arcade mazes. See, this game offers 4 packs of mazes, each one having 32 levels, aside from the arcade mode which just has the main 4 like the original game. On top of that, there are 4 difficulty options: easy, normal, crazy, and hard, and no, I don't know why they're ordered like that. As if that weren't enough, this version also adds a slew of multiplayer options. Oh right, I totally forgot to talk about multiplayer, and I even forgot to mention in the last review. In Pac-Man, multiplayer was as simple as enter 2 coins and each player alternates every time they die. Miss Pac-Man's multiplayer works the exact same way in the arcade version. This option is good, but I still would have preferred a simultaneous co-op version. Thankfully, the Genesis version comes to the rescue with 3 different options for multiplayer. Alternating, mimicking the arcade version's multiplayer style. Competitive, where 2 players take on the same maze simultaneously and fight for the highest score with the leader being shown at the top of the screen. And cooperative, which is just like competitive, but the top shows the total combined score between the 2 players rather than which one's in the lead. Competitive and cooperative multiplayer, especially combined with the Pac Booster, is so much fun to play. It reminds me a lot of Pac-Man Arrangement, which came out 5 years after this Genesis port. Clearly this was a source of inspiration for Arrangement's core gameplay, but I digress. You can really blaze through these mazes when tackling them with 2 people simultaneously, though it is pretty annoying that both players get stopped and reset when just one player dies. Fortunately though, each player does have their own set of lives. The biggest issue with multiplayer is this bouncing mechanic. Every time Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man collide, they bounce off of each other, flying backwards uncontrollably, and it's a total pain. This got me and my friend killed several times. The camera can also be very finicky, but it feels like they did the best they could with the hardware available, and the bad camera in multiplayer is just something you'll have to deal with if you want to have fun with friends. Shoutouts to my man Chariot Rider for playing this with me for the multiplayer footage, by the way. I'll leave a link to his channel in the description. Anyway, despite the bouncing issue being kind of annoying, these new multiplayer modes are a wonderful addition that really add a new layer of fun to the Pac-Man formula. 3 points for this great new feature. So how about the different sets of mazes? There's mini, smaller mazes that fit all on one screen, big, larger mazes that stretch even farther vertically than the arcade mazes, and strange, regular-sized mazes with, well, very weird layouts. Before we get into the new mazes though, let's quickly go over the arcade mode. It plays the same mazes in the same order as the original and doesn't have a level counter, so I assume it either goes on endlessly or stops at level 256 like the original game. I'm certainly not going to try and find out myself though. Alright, on to the new stuff. Starting with Mini, it's an okay pack of mazes. In total, there are 6 unique levels, with the first 4 being shortened variations of the arcade mazes and the last 2 being completely original ones. The overall design of these mazes is generally not great, in some cases even worse than the original arcade games, like in the second maze where Eaten Ghosts gets stuck in this loop at the top, or the 2 original mazes you find towards the end of Mini mode, which are just annoying to clear. The 6th maze, which you play in levels 24 and 32, is especially annoying, with the bottom power pellets being blocked off in these corner areas and having no good way of getting to the top of the maze where the majority of dots are located. At least you only have to play this one twice. Mini in general can be pretty difficult with a smaller playing field, making it harder to dodge ghosts, but at the same time there are less dots you have to eat to clear mazes, so it kinda balances out. Regardless, the addition of the pack booster, difficulty options, and continues make it manageable and generally more fun to play than the arcade game. Oh yeah, that's something I forgot to mention, this version also gives you 4 continues for a total of 5 sets of lives, as well as allowing you to start new games from the latest level you unlocked before getting a game over. I think this unlock system is either tied to arcade mode or single player only though, as I got as far as level 11 playing Strange in multiplayer, but it still locked me to as far as level 7. Either way, that's another point for the Genesis version. Back to mini mode. The only times I got frustrated with these mazes were the times I died because of a misinput. I was playing this mode on the Switch Pro Controller's D-pad at first, and it was so bad with misinputs that I had to switch to keyboard in the middle of the game. Even then I had a few misinput deaths just because of the high speeds you get from playing at later levels that increase the game speed with the pack booster on. Mini is a mostly fun time, but it can be a bit stressful. Moving on to big, these are easily the worst set of mazes. A lot of the design here is just flat out awful, like there are numerous examples of egregiously long narrow paths and odd awkward sections of the maze that can be stressful to clear. Despite that though, I can still have a decently fun time with big since these mazes, as poor as they can be for Pac-Man maze design, are built around the pack booster, so when used effectively these mazes are still alright. On top of that, since the mazes are so big, you often have a lot of space to maneuver around the ghosts and make your escape. Definitely my least favorite set of mazes, but still an okay time. Finally, there's Strange, and this is by far my favorite set of mazes. For one, there's a unique maze for almost every one of the 32 levels. The first 15 are all brand new, as well as the final maze, and mazes 16 through 31 are all the different mazes from Mini and Big Mode back to back, with a couple of Strange levels reused towards the end. And then it all ends off with this. I had so much fun playing through these mazes, and while the maze design isn't great, it's not too overbearing like the big mazes are. I can tolerate janky Pac-Man maze design when given stuff like the pack booster, difficulty options, continues, and multiplayer to help that experience go down easier. In fact, they help so much that they turn what would be pretty hellish mazes in a standard Pac-Man game and make them into some of the most fun I've had with the maze formula. I'd be willing to give more points for the added content if the mazes were better designed, but the slew of other modes and options help to balance that back in the other direction, making for an overall really enjoyable experience. 3 points for some janky but still very fun new content exclusive to the console version. That about covers everything there is to say about both versions of Miss Pac-Man, so that just leaves us with one question. Who won? Unsurprisingly, the Genesis version enjoys a landslide victory thanks to a bevy of minor improvements and major new features and content. While the arcade version scores some points for visual, sound, and better visibility, it's not nearly enough to keep up with the Genesis version. This home console port improves the story, the cutscenes, and the difficulty balancing by adding continues and multiple difficulty options, simultaneous multiplayer, and an absolutely game-changing run button. That's not to mention the boatload of new mazes. The Genesis version just has so much going for it over the original, it's not even funny. It's so much fun, and I even prefer it to the original arcade game, despite having worse visibility and maze design. That's the power of these new features. But what about the arcade version? While I applaud the developers' efforts in attempting to fix issues with the original game, they ended up going too far with their changes and fixing what wasn't broken. Sure, there's more variety with 4 whole mazes instead of just 1, but only one of them is any good, and you stop seeing it after level 2. Sure, the AI is less predictable, but if you ask me, that isn't really a change anyone was asking for, and it only serves to make the game more annoying for the sake of sucking more quarters out of people's pockets. Sure, the fruit moves around the maze and stays present for much longer now, but actually, there is no catch to that one. That's just a flat-out improvement over the original game. The story has also been improved, as well as the sound design, so it's not all bad, but Miss Pac-Man drops the ball where it mattered most, the core elements of arcade Pac-Man design, the ghost AI and the maze design. Don't get me wrong, for all my complaining, I don't think Miss Pac-Man is a bad game. Trust me, we will see a lot worse come out of the maze formula throughout the course of this marathon. Miss Pac-Man just has issues that I find make it a less enjoyable game than the original, which took the most important things for a Pac-Man game to get right and executed them perfectly. Again, Miss Pac-Man is not a bad game. It's a pretty good one in fact, and I'd much rather play it than most of the arcade Pac-Man games to come after this, but I find it to be disappointing in comparison to the original. Needless to say, I have to disagree with the common consensus that Miss Pac-Man is unquestionably the better game. You know, I never really expect these scripts to get this long. I mean, I'm talking about Miss Pac-Man for God's sake, and I'm sitting here writing a nearly 13-page long script for it. But hey, that's just how these things go when you have so many little details to cover on top of a whole other version of the game to compare and contrast with. That said, I hope you all enjoyed this video and are looking forward to the next one. This marathon is about to get very interesting, with a number of great and not so great sequels and spin-offs following in the footsteps of these two titanic arcade classics. If you liked it, make sure to subscribe and like the video, and if you'd like to support me beyond that, consider checking out my Patreon. Thanks for watching!